The second one is that private actors don't have the information. The information exists, but we haven't got it in the hands of the private decision makers. And the third one is that even if the information exists, we understand the problem, and the private actors actually do know it's a problem and they know they can do things, they're not motivated to do it. That is, it would be inconvenient or costly to them to actually change their behavior. So that first one, no one has information technologies, could be we don't understand the environmental problem, or we don't know what the alternatives are that we could adopt to mitigate it. The second one is that we simply need to engage in education. We need to engage in changing people's values, perhaps, or helping them understand the environmental problem. And the third one is we need to change incentives. Now, an economist would look at this and very quickly say, well, that first category is just the problem that information and innovation are public goods. The second one is that we have imperfect information. And the third one is that we do not have complete property rights. That is, that we have externalities and public goods in these environmental services. These are market failures. And so an economist would just look at this and go, well, we have three different kinds of market failures. How do we address them? If we were to apply this to the plastic bags, we might say, well, we don't actually know whether plastic bags damage the environment, or we don't know how they damage the environment, or we don't know how the plastic bags get into the environment. That's a social question. And we need either science researchers or social research to engage, to understand that better. But private parties don't engage in that because they can't capture the benefits of it. It's a private cost, a public good. The third thing we might do, we might say on this is, well, we don't actually know what the alternatives to plastic bags are. Are there any good ways to move goods from retailers to homes without using plastic bags? And so we might want to address that issue. The second one, private actors don't have the information. Maybe the consumers don't understand there's an environmental problem, or they think it's very uncool to be carrying around your own bags to the store, not just from the store. Or alternatively, stores may look at this and go, well, we don't know what's going to happen if we don't use plastic bags. What's our alternatives? So we may want to educate them to say, yes, there are alternatives. Here they are. Finally, maybe consumers know that there's a problem with plastic bags. Maybe we know, the stores know that there are alternatives, but they can't be bothered. It would be expensive for the stores to adopt the alternatives, or they fear they'd lose customers, or alternatively, the consumers just can't be bothered doing anything about this, changing their behavior. So we need to give them an incentive. We need to make plastic bags relatively less attractive than the alternatives. Now, if we look at these three categories, we think about that 100+ policy instruments, we can now do our first, we can apply our first dimension and move the policy instruments into 3 different categories. What I want to do is to actually look in more depth at this third one, the one related to externalities and public goods. In this category alone, there's 65 instruments. So although we've added a little bit of organization to this large number of policy instruments, we need to keep going. So we're going to go to dimensions 2, 3, and 4. The second dimension is the fundamental role of the government. And the government has two possible distinct roles in addressing environmental protection. The first one is entitlement assigning, and the second one is goal setting. And let me first talk about entitlement assigning. Under the entitlement assigning, the government takes a fairly passive role. It says, we're going to establish the rules of the game, then you folks work it out. You decide what level of environmental quality you're going to pursue. You decide who's going to pay for that, negotiate it, and so on. And so down this path, the government says, here's property rights. We're defining property rights, now bargain to an outcome. So we could imagine down this path, if we're worried about air emissions, because the government could say, chemical companies, you can emit. People who are affected by that can go to the chemical companies and negotiate with them to reduce their emissions, making a payment for the costs of the emissions reduction. That would be investing the property right in the chemical company, but at least there's a clear property right in the negotiation process, can take it from there. On the liability rules, it's a little bit far-fetched, but suppose on the plastic bag example, the government adopted a policy that said everyone who gives away plastic bags has to put their name on it. And then any damage done by their plastic bags, they're liable for. So anyone who wants to can sue them for the damage done by their plastic bags. That's a pretty wild description of a policy instrument. But what having the taxonomy does is it invites that kind of, what would one of these look like? How would you apply this instrument to that problem? And I can guarantee you, by the way, that if retailers thought they were going to be liable for the damage their bags did, they would take more seriously the issue of looking for alternatives. So there's a handful of those 65 policy instruments that fall under this entitlement assignment role for government. But the rest go under the goal-setting role. Why would we favor an active government role over a passive one? Why not just establish the property rights and let the private sector take over? The answer is because when you get many polluters or many parties damaging the environment, or many people affected by that, the cost of the negotiations or the cost of the litigation starts to go up exponentially with more parties. And so there's a legitimate role for the government to step in and aggregate the interests of the public and of the business community and work out mechanisms to help them actually achieve better outcomes than if the government had not intervened. So down this path, the government actually sets environmental goals, adopts regulations or manipulates incentives, and then directly intervenes whenever there are violations of the rules. So let's take a closer look at this. Now the third dimension was who decides, and that's shorthand for who do we give discretion to? Do we invest all authority in the government, and the government will make all decisions about how pollution is abated? Or do we invest discretion in the private parties? Do we allow them to figure out how they're going to reduce their pollution? The first one is a command and control approach. We'll tell you what to do. The second one is the incentive-based instruments or market-based instruments, where you say, look, we're concerned about the outcome. You adopt the practices, the technologies, and so on that are going to do that at the least cost. And this is the way that economists have classically described this. It's incentive-based instruments, which are good because they give discretion to private parties to be innovative, or command and control instruments, which are bad. Why? Because they take away all the discretion, creativity, and innovation from the private sector. But that dichotomy is actually a false dichotomy. There's lots of instruments in the middle where the government and the government and the private sector share discretion, and they iterate back and forth, or they share discretion over different elements. And so, in fact, even this diagram is misleading because it's not that there's categories, but there's an entire continuum between the two extremes of government decides versus private decides. There's an entire continuum of instruments. Now, of instruments for discretion sharing. Now, that's the third dimension. The fourth dimension is who pays. And really, more precisely, it's who pays for what. Because there's two kinds of costs involved in environmental protection. There's the cost of actually reducing emissions or reducing environmental damage, the cost of adopting new practices or installing new technologies. But there's also the cost of the unabated damage, the remaining damage. So even if we say to a company, you need to reduce your emissions to a certain level, or you need to reduce your environmental damages to a certain level, we still have to say, but what about the pollution or the environmental damage that's not abated? Who's going to bear that cost?